Today in the EU, why authoritarian leaders are on the rise, according to the latest UN report. Around the globe, the number of citizens who show unwavering support for democracy is on the rise, but so are the figures of those voting for leaders who may undermine democracy. Today, for the first time ever, more than half the global population supports such leaders. We spoke to United Nations Development Programme Pedro Conceiçao and Politics Hub editor Aurelie Pugnet to zoom in on the implications for the European Union elections. Hi, Aurelie.
Hi.
I recently spoke to Pedro Conceiçao. The UN latest report highlights the come about of the so-called democracy paradox. Can you briefly explain what that refers to?
The democracy paradox means, as he explains himself, that everyone basically believes in democracy. Everyone wants to live in a democracy. Everyone wants to be a part of it. But then, when you look at the results of the elections, people who vote, so do the democratic act of voting and giving their voice to create what society they want to live in, they actually vote for leaders that are more likely to actually be less democratic than a democracy would actually be. So more maybe authoritarian, who are curtailing liberties, freedoms, maybe having more conservative values and are therefore deemed less democratic.
When I asked Conceiçao about how this phenomenon applies to the European Union, he replied,
"That's like the epicenter of the democracy paradox. So just as an illustration, the share of the vote in European elections, national elections, that has gone to parties that could be classified as populist, meaning anti-elite discourse against pluralism, has increased over the course of this century. So as this democracy paradox also started to emerge.
The United Nations is reluctant to single out the countries affected. However, it is our jobs as journalists to do so. So which are these countries?
In Europe, it's a lot, actually. When you look at the governments currently in place in Europe and how the next elections are going to go and how people are going to vote, what you see is that a lot of governments at the moment feature parties that are from the far right side, so extremist right side of the hemicycle and of the political spectrum. So, for example, you can talk about Italy, where the Prime Minister herself, Giorgia Meloni, comes from Fratelli d'Italia, which is a country traditionally set on the far right. In other countries like Slovakia as well, there's been issues mentioned of, for example, around press freedom.
Hungary is one of the countries that has been looked at with concern by other European member states.
Indeed, the Prime Minister Viktor Orban is seen as very controversial, and it is also seen like that by the European Commission. And that means that there is a lot of concern as to whether the rule of law and the liberties and the values and the freedoms that do reflect what Europe and what Europeans want to believe in is actually put into question. But other countries that maybe are not on the top of the news agenda sometimes also include Finland, for example, where the government, which is on the center-right side, has made a deal to include the far-right parties in its government. You can also talk about the future Dutch government, which also would feature far-right parties. In France, the opposition is also very, very much focused on the far-right parties of Marine Le Pen. So it's a trend that we see really across Europe.
One of the root causes of the democracy paradox, according to the UNDP, is polarization.
The reason, according to the report, has a lot to do with the context of polarization. So the fact that societies are being divided and taking very different and sometimes extreme views on going back to climate change, on whether we are doing too much or not enough. So these very polarizing views are impeding our ability to address shared challenges, both within countries and across countries.
How has polarization hindered or is hindering EU negotiations across the latest challenges that the Union has faced?
Polarization is definitely visible within the 27 member states of the EU, I would say. When we take, for example, like I was saying, like Hungary on one side and other countries, let's say, Slovakia maybe had to deal with support for Ukraine, you can see that countries like Hungary and Slovakia would say, well, basically, no one listens to us and we have a very different view. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily playing the victim or anything like that, but it's really like a big gap between the others and them. And that does add more to the narrative or fuel to the fire of those governments that say, well, we are here to tackle what the establishment looks like, the political establishment, and we're here to offer a different way of living and a different way of doing democracy and a different way of actually all working together. So when they say, well, the war in Ukraine should stop now because we want peace, it is something that sounds acceptable to everyone. I mean, I think you and I can agree that peace in Ukraine would be a great thing. However, when you listen to the other countries, they say, well, if you stop Ukraine now and then you put peace at the forefront of the agenda, then you also ask the Ukrainians to stop fighting and give the territories that the Russians have, well, invaded and actually settled on, that they could keep them. So, and then you have then a very big division between those two camps.
Speaking of division, of course, the UNDP has analyzed European trends, but within the European Union, there are very much intestine conflicts. Let's look at regional trends and how regional alliances have played into the challenges that the European Union is traversing at the moment.
There are interesting differences. So, for instance, changes in unemployment and support for European institutions, or if you express differently, support for European integration, whether European integration is going too far, hasn't gone far enough. We see that there's a difference between the south of Europe and Central and Northern Europe. So when there's an increase in unemployment in Southern Europe, this is associated with people expressing support for the idea that European integration needs to deepen. But in Central and Northern Europe, the opposite happens.
What is interesting, I think, in what we see that would come out of the elections is, according to the projections that we have and what we understand from the polls, is the rise of populist parties or parties that are maybe more controversial because they have a tendency to the far right and to also often propose easy and quick solutions to very complicated and complex problems that actually happens all across the continent. Then what I think is interesting in what the UN is saying is that they say it's for different reasons, basically. When you look at the South, it is because they look up to the EU to provide a solution, whereas in the North, basically, they look at themselves and their own state to provide the solution. And that comes basically just down to a matter of sort of culture. When you were looking at what happened during the COVID pandemic, the Italians, funnily enough, like the EU is not usually the number one organization you look up to or you look towards when you're trying to find a solution to health problems. And yet Italy and the Italian government was very quick to ask Brussels for a solution and for coordinations and things like that, whereas countries more in the north and in the east were maybe less interested, but actually interested in the vaccines. And everyone, of course, has their own interest. And in Spain, for example, or in Italy or in France, where the welfare state is very important and you want to provide social support to your citizens and help them get jobs and employment, also where the unemployment rate is very high, where the young really have trouble finding jobs, then of course they're going to look to every possible option, maybe. At least that's the way I see it. Whereas if you come from a country like Sweden, where the economy is heavily market-based, people just really believe in the market and just to do its own thing, and the government is the one in charge. Why would you look to the EU when you've always been taught that things kind of move the way they do? It's just a very different way of looking at the government, questioning authorities, and it's a cultural differences.
Right. And when it comes to the relationship of individual citizens to the government, another core issue at the root of the democracy paradox is this eroding trust in institutions and in others.
It's crucial to recognize that often people agree on more than they think they do when it comes to climate change, which is one of these issues that is polarizing societies, with some people thinking that we're doing too much, other thinking that we are not doing enough. And this generates very passionate views and very polarizing views. But yet, when you ask people, almost 70% of the population around the world says that they would be willing to make a personal financial sacrifice to mitigate climate change.
Are political parties in the EU incorporating these concerns in their manifestos at all?
In the manifesto, there's definitely not something that you necessarily see heavily featured, or not as such. What is, although obvious, and what the parties propose at the European level, and what we see from the discussions that they have between themselves, is that the parties that are or can be considered less democratic because they basically change press freedom and they change justice freedom, and they just question a lot of things that are rights that were always given to people. It also comes to minorities, for example, and their rights. Voters no longer trust the current system, and therefore they look for new solutions.
That's not necessarily something that maybe you've noticed, but also as a voter, you see this data, you see how concerning the democracy paradox is and the trends that are shaping our future. How are our politicians, the people that are supposed to take this into account and to defend democracy, what are they doing? What is their plan?
I do think, in a way, that politicians from traditional parties, so let's say socialist, center, liberal, and then the right-wing traditional parties, that they don't see the issue. Because look at how the center-right parties are dealing more and more with the far right. Look at even the liberals dealing with the far right. Look at how the far right parties, and we can also talk about far left, but the far right are the ones that are getting more and more support. How they are counting on TikTok, for example, to gather a lot of votes from the young. And when you talk to more traditional parties, they say, well, no, we're not on TikTok because it's a Chinese media. But you say, okay, sure, but have you opened TikTok lately? When you open it, like Bardella, so who's the leader of the Rassemblement National, the far-right party in France, he's like in the first few reels. So you go down and like you're 5 videos in, and here you go. You have far-right parties giving you easy solutions to, like I said, very complex problems. And they are proposing something to, like you say, the lack of trust in the current system, which is, okay, you've tried everything for the past 70 years, let's say after the World War. You tried everything. You tried all the other parties, but trust us for 1 second. Give us the right to be in power. Give us the right to be in government. And let's see if we can actually make it. And we'll show you that your life will be better. When you're a voter and you've been extremely disappointed because you're always asking for more and you're expecting more from your politicians, and you've seen how the socialists in that country or the liberals in your country or the center-right in your country has not delivered on those promises, and you see someone who says, I can make your life better, and trust me, I have never been in government because I was never allowed to, and people don't want to work with me because they know that I can actually make it work, and I've been excluded from this system, and I can provide you with this best solution, just let me try. I mean, it sounds like a great idea. You think, well, let me try and place my trust in this guy or this woman first. And if it doesn't work, in 5 years, I'll change again. And if it means that I'm losing a little bit of freedom for more security, if it means I'm losing a little bit of money for more security, or everyone has their own way of deciding what is right and wrong and what they are ready to lose to gain something else.
But still, it is a compelling narrative, the one that the far right.
It is very compelling. I mean, it sounds like a dream. It's, oh yeah, you'll all have jobs. Say, okay, great. But if it's that easy, the question I'm asking myself, why hasn't it happened before? And you get into this question of, okay, but when you ask those people, okay, well, you're presenting a very easy solution, fine, we'll create this many jobs. But to create jobs, you need money. If it's in the public service, for example. So does that mean you're going to create more tax? So you're going to tax people to get more money to create those jobs in the public sector. And they say, no, we're not going to levy more tax. Okay, so how do you pay for those? And then you get into questions that are very concrete. And then when you go into it, then sometimes it's very difficult to get an answer. Sometimes you have answers and you may like them or not like them. But it is very compelling, yeah.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me.